ways, because it's like a little course of instruction, if you like, training course. If you look at it that way, because the same messages basically were given. He'd have the first day that he'd be with us, first full day, he'd say that now the main part of my work has been done in that first day. So even though he stayed in different times, in different places, there was still a basic structure and a basic work which was done at each time, at each place. And it's the same, like it was around about the same period. He had a meeting in late 1955 in India, and then in the West, it was in July in America and August in Australia. Now the main messages and main purpose of all those meetings were the same. And the same happened in 1958. Meetings were held in India in February, in America in May, and in Australia in June. And basically the essential parts, the must-knows, if you like, in training people you've got the must-knows, the should-knows and the could-knows. Well, the must-knows and the should-knows are there, all in each one, and they're the same. But because he spent more time in some places than others, and one of the places was America, he did more discourses, but they'd be the could-knows. They weren't the essential parts. So in that one volume, you have those essential parts, but then there's more than that. That's the essential parts of the meeting. And in the first meeting, the emphasis was on love. And in love was obedience, but it was essentially emphasizing love and a feeling of love, feeling his outflowing of love. And he'd be filling in the background, telling us who he was, about creation, about how to prevent unwanted thoughts becoming actions or unwanted actions, and so on. And about worry. Worry is always very dissipating. So he gives a discourse on worry, how to prevent worry. And also on love. The difference between human love and divine love. And then he wouldn't let us sit on the fence. We couldn't be just there to be an observer. We either had to commit ourselves or not. And you either had to commit yourself or not in the first time physically leave, but you wouldn't be attached to him. So that decision had to be made at the first meeting. And that was the same in India and America. India in 55 and America in 56. And the details are fairly well recorded of the Indian Savas in Don Stevens' book, Listen Humanity. And then the details of the American visit are in The Awakener. And now the details of the Australian visit are in practical spirituality. Then he told us that the body was only the veil. Each time that God comes on earth, he veils himself with the body. And it has a different name at a different time. But the messages are always the same, essentially the same. But sometimes there's different words used to convey the same message. Each one of us was given 5 minutes of time to be with him, exclusive time with him personally, in 1956. And I don't know what happened to all the others. Some of them have told me what happened. But what happened with me was that when I went to the room with Baba was sitting higher than I was, and there was a seat here for me to sit on. So I sat down on the seat, and it did seem to be a bit of, a little bit of radiance there where he was, but I don't know, with the impression it was just, I might have been wrong. But I just sat down on the seat and he put his arm across my shoulder there. And I didn't wish to know anything because his presence was so all-fulfilling. There seemed to be no question to ask, nothing to be answered. His presence was the answer to everything. I didn't need anything when I was in his presence and didn't wish to ask anything. And then I started to feel waves of love emanating from him, as though they're just falling over me like that, one after the other. And there's energy in it, but the only way I can describe it is a wave of love. And it'd just be as though it was a wave coming over like this, emanating from him, as it were, and just coming right over me. And I just sat there, and then 5 minutes was up. I would have liked to have sat there much longer, but still, how fortunate to just be allowed to have that time exclusively in his presence. It was strange. When he'd be sitting in his presence, and we'd be as close as this, he'd be, say, sitting on a divan there, and we'd be sitting on the floor around him. I'm not sure how many people there were, but there weren't many. There might have been 30 or something like that, but I'm not sure the numbers. But it was just such a little group of people. And he'd be giving some discourse, and his words would seem to penetrate the heart so deeply that you'd find that you would be involuntarily weeping. You'd just find tears welling up and coming down out of the eyes. And one time I looked around and everyone was weeping. I wasn't the only one. I thought I might have been. I had to look round and everyone was weeping. And I was looking at Baba, but then I looked at Erich. There's tears coming out of her, just in his face. And he must have, it was a discourse that he must have spoken to them many times. It wouldn't be the first time. But that's just how, hearing the truth from the source of truth, that was just how powerful it was. It just would penetrate the heart. And I don't know why I wept, but I tried to think about it later, and I don't know whether this was right or not, but it just seemed to be, we seemed to be, as it were, so privileged or so unique or something. We were there and we were experiencing that. And yet how could we tell any other people about it the way he's telling us? We seem to be so inadequate to convey to others what he'd conveyed to us. One had a sense of feeling powerless because he was conveying truth so forcefully. And with what happened to myself personally, after probably about 2 or 3 days, it was as though there was a change of mood or change of attitude. And instead of viewing the whole situation from the viewpoint of, say, a creature, I started to view it from, it must have been a higher viewpoint, maybe just because of his closeness. And then suddenly, the whole situation seemed to be so humorous. It was looking at it from a higher point of view. And instead of feeling that you were the victim and helpless, everything just seemed to be hilarious. Even when things were happening to you, I just couldn't help laughing. And I'd be laughing at everything. I'd see the humour of the situation, but it wasn't from the point of view of the creature. It was from a different point of view. And also then at that time, I'd sometimes say something, and it wouldn't be something that I'd have thought out beforehand, and everyone would start laughing, and I'd do a double take, and I'd think, what did I say? And it would have been something very humorous. And I'm not a very humorous person. I wouldn't have been able to think of it. And yet, I'd be dropping bits of humour here and there. And then other times there'd be something, I'd say it'd be profound, but I wouldn't know until it had gone past me, and I'd do a double take. And I'd think, did I say that? I hadn't thought about it. And yet I'd said something that was beyond me to have thought or said, and not really my nature to have done it. And that was the next kind of phase. The weeping phase seemed to stop. And then that humorous phase, if you like, seemed to take over. It was better than it seemed to be better than the weeping phase. Although the weeping phase was all right. It was years later. I mentioned something to Erich about the weeping, and he said, "It's cool tears." He said, like you can have hot tears or cool tears. So, cool tears. It's when he said that we were so busy we didn't have time to bathe ourselves. So that was our daily ablutions with Baba. We would be bathed in these cool tears. It was one day when Baba was coming to my house. And it was rather strange how he came to my house, because I hadn't thought of inviting him. And Francis wasn't the one to have Baba going here, there, everywhere, to everyone's house. So I was probably lucky, due to my ignorance. I didn't know why Baba visited some houses in Melbourne, because at the last minute in Sydney, when Baba came to Sydney on Thursday afternoon, and we went out to Beacon Hill, and on Friday we had a full session with Baba all day Friday. That was the main day. On Saturday morning there was a public session, but there was a little session earlier. The people that hadn't all had their private sessions, sometimes some of them had private sessions early, before about 9 o'clock or maybe 9:30. And then the public session, I think, was supposed to finish at noon. We advanced that to 11:30. We used to usually advance things and make it a bit earlier. So I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't 700 years when he came back next time, but 6.5 or something like that, because he's a bit tricky like that. It would be Baba time, and Baba time would always be earlier, we come to realise. So after he'd finished with the public darshan, scheduled time for Melbourne, say, was something like 7 o'clock or 5 o'clock later in the day. So he advanced that to, say, 2:30 or something, and everyone had to scramble to get ready. And then he invited us all, anyone who wanted to come down to Melbourne, out of the group could come, provided it didn't interfere with their work, job, or they could afford to do it. They were welcome to come. Now, I'm not sure when he invited them there, because he'd sent me, I'd had to go to Manly on an errand, and so I wasn't there all the time. But when I found out that I could go to Melbourne, well, of course I wanted to go to Melbourne, because by this time it was rather wonderful to be in his company, we found. It was just something special about his company. And you just liked being with him. And you didn't even like wanting to go for lunch. I mean, he's kind of have to send you away to get rid of you. And of course, then when you weren't with him, you'd be thinking of him, thinking the next time that you would be with him, looking forward to it. And on the first day, in 1956, we had to pledge, or had to say that we loved him, and in love was obedience, so we had to be obedient. And to emphasise the seriousness of it, or someone hadn't raised their hand, and so Baba asked that person why they hadn't raised their hand. I forget why it was. It was they didn't think they could be obedient, or something like that. They weren't sure that they could be obedient anyway, and they didn't think that they could. So then Baba gave them a specific thing. If I asked you to swing your children in the ocean, could you do that? So that's a kind of a definite instruction, and he doesn't tell you to fling them from a cliff. You could use your mind and perhaps modify it a bit and fling them into a shallow ocean, or if they've been particularly naughty that day, you could fling them into a deeper part and hope for the best. But rub that out. But he asked him, could he fling his children in the ocean for Baba, for him? So this person said yes. So he could do it. He could love him and be with him. So, but that emphasised the seriousness of it. And Baba told us that he would take our hearts to India. And so one had to commit oneself. And I got a little bit of a shock. It just didn't happen immediately here. But then I'd never heard of the term Baba lover. And here I'd become a Baba lover. I was a bit surprised. How did I become a Baba lover? Well, I wasn't too sure that I liked the term even at first. So, but when I reasoned it logically, I just promised to love Baba. I did love him. So I suppose I was a Baba lover. Well, I felt a little bit strange if someone used the term. And Baba lover, it took a while to get used to it. So in 1958, Baba told us in 1956 that he had come to suffer for humanity, and that we weren't to worry when the burden of the suffering came upon him, because it was inevitable. That is why he was here. And he told us that this dark cloud was almost upon him, and it would be very soon. But when it happened, we weren't to worry, and we'd just previously had a discourse on worry, and worry is very dissipating of energy. So he didn't want us to worry about that. And it was about 4 months after that that he had the accident in India where he was smashed up, broken hip, and suffered greatly. And I suppose it emphasised suffering. He had invited us to come to India for Savas in November for a whole month in 1957. And of course that had to be postponed because he wasn't well enough. And then he would prefer to combine Savas in India in February, but he could only hold the Eastern Savas then, so. And within the time span, there was a limit to the time that it had to be, that he put a limit on it. So he had to have the Eastern one in India and the Western Savas in Myrtle Beach and Australia. And there'd been no part of Australia nominated at that time. And the part that he had visited in 1956 was my house in Sydney and Dr. O'Brien's home in Melbourne. And early in the piece, there's no mention that he was coming to Australia. There's no mention about where. We were to get our details later. It was fairly soon afterwards, but we didn't know at first. We just knew that he was coming to Australia. I was going to tell you why he came to my house. Went off at a tangent. What had happened, which I didn't know anything about, was that there had been 6 homes, 6 private homes, offered for his accommodation in Melbourne. And in Sydney, Francis Brabazon had been building a house made of stone from a block of land that was just a stony outcrop, all Sydney sandstone. He had intended building a house, spiritual centre, originally, and then after he met Barbara, it was to be for Barbara. He was hoping that one day Barbara would come to Australia. And of course, Francis had a tremendous background of spiritual masters. And he had read the story of Milarepa, and in that story there's a master has his disciple build a stone house, and then that's not good enough. He's got to demolish it and build another one, and this happened 7 times. So with Francis we were very familiar with a lot of spiritual stories, because he would every Saturday night give us a spiritual story of some of the great spiritual personalities in history of the past. It was a lovely time because he was such a wonderful storyteller, and he wouldn't look at a note and it would be different personality, spiritual personality each week, and he just seemed to have a wonderful background of these spiritual people. And it was very helpful in preparing us to meet MeherBaba. So to come back to, I seem to be getting sidetracked all the time. To come back to the invitation to the house. What happened, he'd been invited to stay in 6 houses. We couldn't do that very well, so... Yeah, unless he stayed for 6 days or something and moved a lot. So, musical houses. So anyway, there was one chosen for him, and as being the most comfortable and suitable for many reasons. It was Dr. O'Brien's house in Camberwell. And the second day that he was there, he visited all the other homes because he'd been invited to them. So he was kind of honouring the invitation and visiting them. But fortunately I didn't know this. So I just thought that these lucky people had invited MeherBaba to visit their home, and he was visiting them. So, and we were allowed to visit them if we could hitch a lift with one of the locals. And I was staying with the Bruford's, Jack Painter and I were both staying at the Bruford's, and we did start to go on house visits. We went to, I think the first one was at the Bruford's. Pa was being taken around in Dr. O'Brien's car, and I went in the Bruford's car to their place, and then to the next place. I think I went to about 3 places, finished at Clarence Adams, and then we got lost. I think Dr. O'Brien took the wrong turn, and he asked Barbara a spiritual question, and Barbara gave such an involved answer that, he forgot where he was going. He had to do a big detour back about 2 miles to get back onto the route, and then whoever was following him thought he was going to another place, and they went the wrong way, and he shook them off.
Now we know about questions.
So, when you're driving, particularly, yeah. So, anyway, it was such a detailed answer. So, when we got on the aircraft to come back to Sydney, I started to think about these houses that Barbara had visited. And of course, we're in this old DC-4 aircraft, and Barbara sitting back here somewhere, further ahead, up the aisle a bit. And I'm thinking, oh, I wish I'd have only known. If I'd only thought of inviting Barbara, because now we wouldn't be able to change anything. The timing had been all set, the program had been set. And what I should do, if I want Barbara to visit my place now, I should go to Francis, who's the head of the group, and ask Francis, would he ask Barbara, to tell him that I'd like to invite Barbara to visit my home. So I think I've got Buckley's chance of getting Francis on side. I'm thinking, Francis, you'd never get past him. So, because he'd have planned the next day, I think we're only going for a drive up to the mountains or somewhere. It was a leisure day, a lay day, as they say in the classics. But that was how I was feeling, that if only I'd known, I'd have loved to invite Barbara to my house, and yet now I won't be able to because Francis would just veto it. So right at that moment, a message comes from Barbara. John, come and sit next to Barbara. So I go up to sit next to Barbara, and I suddenly think, oh, I'll be sitting next to Barbara. I don't have to go through Francis now. I can just invite him to my club. He's sitting right next to him. So I sat down next to Barbara, and I said, Barbara, would you like to visit my home tomorrow? Barbara says, yes. 10 o'clock. Go and sit down in your seat. Go back up. And there was another person, there was a lady called Frances Lee. And she was thinking the same thing. So a message comes up, Frances, come and sit next to Barbara. and so Frances asked Barbara to visit her home the next morning. And Barbara responds and says, yes, 11 o'clock, go and sit in your seat. So it's very handy having this avatar that reads the minds. He can sort a lot of things out. And I was so fortunate that I didn't know why Barbara had visited the homes in Melbourne. Because had I known, I wouldn't have felt that way. I wouldn't have asked. Or I wouldn't have felt like asking. And wouldn't have, I would have thought, oh, well, there's no chance, no question. But because I thought that they'd been able to ask him, which they had invited him to their house, but there wasn't the opportunity to do that in Sydney, and because I was mistaken about what happened. So some of these mistakes are very helpful if a person makes a mistake out of ignorance. So sometimes all the things we do in ignorance aren't harmful. Sometimes they're beneficial.
And did he go down all those stairs to your house?
No, I had a different house.
Describe what happened when he came to your house.
Are you coming on Saturday night? Oh, I don't know.
Oh, you're going to tell us.
No, I probably won't, because it's in the book. It depends whether you get the long version or the short version. Well, I'll tell you, I might as well tell you that, because it's, I might be able to give you a little bit more detail. So, what had happened, I was the Bible lover in the family, and my wife wasn't, and I'd wanted to have a picture of Barbara in my home, and she hadn't. And I could understand that. So I thought, well, we won't argue about that. We won't have a picture of her. So, but she knew that I wanted to have one. So I thought, well, I'll just keep Barbara in my heart, and won't have a picture of him. And we won't argue about it. So that fixed that. So then, when Baba came, there was the public day on the Saturday. So my wife and children came and met Baba on the Saturday. And I used to carry my daughter sometimes. She was about 1 year old. Sometimes I'd carry her on my shoulders. And Baba told me not to do that. To take her off and to be very careful with her. Like, I don't know whether he's thinking that she might hit her head on a doorpost or something, and I don't know the significance of it, but he did tell me to be very careful of her and not to put her on my shoulders, which I didn't do anymore. So I went to Melbourne, then I came back to Sydney. So that was Sunday and Monday, back to Sydney Monday evening. So I came home to tell my wife that Baba was coming to visit us the next morning. And she loved having visitors. But because I was on shift work, it was quite difficult sometimes because arranging the shifts and so on, so she used to never quite get as many visitors as she would have liked. Now here was the avatar coming to visit her. So that must have made up for something. Balanced something out. But anyway, she, on her own initiative, he must have impressed her. Because on that Monday, without knowing that he was coming to our house, she went out and bought a picture frame and put the picture of Baba in the frame and put it on the bookcase in the lounge room. And I wasn't there, I was down in Melbourne. So, then I came home and told her that Baba would be coming at 10 o'clock in the morning. Oh, great panic. She wanted to make a garland for him. And it was winter time and there weren't many flowers in the garden. But right at the back we had a big coral tree, that's an Indian tree, with big green leaves and little red flowers. And so here my son climbed up the tree in the night in the dark and broke off some branches with these red flowers on them. So I brought them into the house and then my wife could make the garland for Baba from those flowers. And then she wanted to make a cake. And so I said to her, well, make sure that you put plenty of love in the cake. That's the main ingredient. So she took notice of me and put plenty of love in the cake. But unfortunately, the cake got burnt. The top of the cake got burnt, you see. Just the top. Now, you might think this is no problem. It wouldn't be here because your shop's open all night, or a lot of the night. But our shops close at 6 o'clock, and this is a Monday night. We can't get any more flour or butter or anything, so that was the last in the house, flour, so. No more complete ingredients. So I said to her, but were you going to ice the cake? She says, yes. I said, there's no problem. All you just do is to cut the burnt part off the top of the cake and shape it nicely and ice it. But do it with love. So she thought about this and thought, what else could you do? So you cut the burnt part off the cake and shaped it nicely and iced it and looked lovely. So there was the cake. And of course, there was a mad activity on cleaning the house up, vacuum cleaning the house, and went on far into the night. Well, plus you make the garland and cake and all this, you know. So, can't think of anything else that happened that night. But previously, Francis had emphasised the importance of being close to Baba and living on the property if he could. Now, I only lived about half a mile away, and there were actually people, there were more women than men there, and there was a garage just to have a dirt floor. I don't know whether maybe we put a concrete floor in it for the Baba's visit. But it had bunks put in it for the women. It was their quarters. And we had thought that we could do the cooking in the house, but it didn't turn out that way, because Baba had the complete house.
Where was this?
This is at Beacon Hill.
Oh.
So I'm getting around to telling you that I didn't stay home at night. I went up to Beacon Hill. So, but I was there. This is not the first night I was there. This is the second night. So I stayed at Beacon Hill the first night in a tent to be close to Baba, even though I only lived half a mile away. And yet there were two ladies living at my place, staying there, because there wasn't enough accommodation for the ladies at Beacon Hill, because they weren't in the tents, they were in the garage, and it was a bit. Sometimes you get very cold winds from Sydney blowing off the mountains, and it is a bit cold in the tents. So anyway, this is the second night, and I'm a bit late. There was all this activity in the house, so I get up there at about 1 o'clock. Ooh, sleeping in my bed. Someone had come in a bit earlier than me, and there was a spare bed there. And I thought, oh, well, he mustn't be coming home. And there was no curfew like there is at MeherBabaLibrary now. You could stay out after 10 o'clock. These things hadn't been thought of. So I thought I'll still stay on the property. So there was someone who had a station wagon there that was left open, and there was someone else's, I don't think it was a sleeping bag, I think it was a rug or something. So I sleep in the back of the station wagon on a rug, you know, just to be close to Baba, you know, where he is, instead of going down home and sleeping in my own bed. So, and I slept in, I think, the chap's station wagon. I think he was in my bed. I was in his station wagon, and I had someone else's rug to keep warm. So it was a bit of a mixture. So then I must have gone home to be there for Baba 10 o'clock. And it's a funny thing that on the public day, people that are invited, like my mother and neighbours, they just couldn't make it. Yet on this day, when I invited my mother, she could make it, and I invited a neighbour, she could make it. There was another neighbour that I invited. It was a bit of a shock to him, because, you know, I hadn't told him much about MeherBabaLibrary. He was a very good friend. But on the day, when we'll say Christ is coming to visit your home and you've got a good friend, well, you wouldn't want to keep him out of it, would you? So, not if he's a really good friend. So this man was a builder. And he, broke the news to him as gently as I could. I forget what I said, but it was like, I'd like you to come and meet. I don't know whether I said a friend of mine. Well, I'm having a visitor coming today. I'd like you to meet him. He's like Christ. And his name is MeherBabaLibrary, and you're very welcome to meet him. So he actually declined my kind offer, and he said, well, you better be going to work. So he was probably late already and something like that. So anyway, the strange thing that happened was that when Baba came at 10 o'clock, this chap was on his way to work. He picked up another man who used to work for him. And that other man had previously lived next door to me, and now his relatives were living there. He picked him up, and right at 10 o'clock, that man started to sing Baba's name. Baba, Baba, Baba. I don't know what tune. This builder had been told that it was MeherBabaLibrary. He looked at his watch and it was 10 o'clock. And he associated this fellow had never heard of MeherBabaLibrary, and yet he's singing his name. He's invited to meet MeherBabaLibrary, and he thinks there's something going on here, And he told me about that. He was so shocked that he told me about that, what had happened in the car, in the utility. So, yeah. Anyway, my father-in-law at that time, who had been crippled with arthritis and was on crutches, we rang him up. He lived about a mile away, and he didn't answer the phone himself, so he was left a message, and of course the message got probably dent in the transmission. So he probably journalised a bit to himself, because on that day we were scheduled to go up to Katoomba, take Barbara up for a drive to Katoomba, somewhere up in the mountains. So Pop thought that we wanted to borrow his bigger car for the occasion. So he brought his car over to our place. And unfortunately or fortunately, as the case may be for Pop, it was too close to 10 o'clock to take him back, because I had to be there for Baba. We got there about 5 to 10. So, and it was a sunny day, and he had difficulty getting dressed sometimes, and he had his pants on with this kind of flannel singlet that had sleeves to about here, and braces over the top of this, and he's hobbled on his crutches, and he hadn't been bothered getting dressed. He's just driving the car home. He's going to go back home and then probably get dressed then, so you see. So he hadn't realised he was going to be meeting the Avatar. So it was a little bit of a shock to him when we tell him that MeherBabaLibrary is coming to visit us, and it's too late to take him home. He's got to stay here. So he's a bit embarrassed with his dress. So up the back of the house, I built a workshop with a little patio, and it was sheltered from the wind and everything, and it was a nice sunny spot. So he goes through the house, and he just comes out this little patio outside the back door, and he's just standing in a spot there and looking up here, and he says, in this very spot, if MeherBabaLibrary wants to meet me, I'll be up here. Trying to get away and hoping that he doesn't see him or doesn't want to. He's embarrassed because of his dress. So off he goes and sits up there in the sun. There's a chair and a table, just very comfortable. He's nice and warm up there. So Scene changes. It's the front door, 10 o'clock. Baba comes to the front door, and my wife garlands him. And so she gets a warm embrace from Baba. And Baba starts to look into each room in the house. So first of all he goes into our bedroom. And he gestures towards the desk. He embraces me. I'm not quite sure what it's for, but I'll work out later that I'd bought 2 copies of God Speaks. And I bought one to lend to people and one to keep myself. I didn't want to lend them my copy while I was reading it, so. And we had been told to sell, we'd been set a target to sell 100 God Speaks before we came. And we sold 107, so we reached the target figure. So. Then he went from there, and all the visitors had assembled in the lounge room. So he went from there down the hall into the lounge room, and he sees the picture and he gestures towards the picture and embraces my wife. And then he's introduced to all the other people, the neighbour, my mother, and he goes out of that room to the other bedroom, bathroom, kitchen. And he comes out to the pasture on exactly the spot where Pop had said what he said before. He stops. He goes no further. So I was looking at there, and I say, Baba, would you like to meet my father-in-law? And Eric says, Baba says, would he like to meet me? And he's standing right in that spot. He didn't move. So, of course, Papa said, if he wants to meet me, I'll be up there. He didn't say he wanted to meet him. So he stays there. He's got to say that he wants to meet him. So I rush up to Pop and I say, Pop, now Baba wants to know, do you want to meet him? Oh, yes, he says, yes. And he goes to get up, and get his crutches, and well, at this time Baba's up there. Of course, if you make one step towards God, God will make 10 steps towards you. It literally seemed to happen. And Pop said, Salam Alaka, because he'd been in the Middle East during the war in Egypt. And so Baba Fredericks responds with Malakalam Salam and embraces him. And then we go back to the house, and Baba, I forget whether he cut the cake, had the cake cut, or put the knife in and then we cut it. But Baba often wouldn't take he wouldn't even have the cake cut, or he'd be at someone's place and not have the cake. But this time cake was cut and he had the first slice. So the only thing I can think of was making it with love. I don't know. But he did have a slice of that cake, and he had the first slice, and then we all had slices. And then while we were finishing slicing the cake up, he disappeared into the lounge room. And what he did, the kids watched through the crack in the door. He took his garland off and he put it over the picture so that it looked as though it was round his neck and over behind his neck in the picture. And so he garlanded his picture. Now, there'd been, I don't know why, in the book you'll read 2 incidents that happened. One of them is between Francis and myself. And the only thing I can think of why they happened was like it was a kind of a cut-off between us. That's all I can think of. Like Francis did have spiritual status, I'd come to Baba through Francis. And the only reason, I really don't know why these things happened, but they were balanced up with two incidents. One with Francis and one with me, or, one worked one way and one balanced the other way. And what happened was that there was a misunderstanding. I understood that Baba had asked for a certain brand of cigarettes, so they were anxious to be obedient. So I immediately went off to get them, and there were shops very nearby, but to be very quick, I hopped into the car and went round there, and they didn't have them. I quickly went down to the next shopping place and quickly back. Baba's gone. And I left without his permission while he was visiting my home. And there was a misunderstanding. There was a message left for me from Baba to say that I was forgiven. And so then I heard what happened in my absence. And what had happened, Baba had invited my wife to accompany him to the pictures, the movies, we call them pictures, movies. So, and that wouldn't have meant that much to most of the other ones in the group. But she was an avid moviegoer. She used to go to the movies every Thursday afternoon with a lady friend down the street. They'd go on the bus, go to the movies, do their shopping, take a taxi home. And this would be the ritual on the Thursday. Because there were probably, the others in the group weren't that interested in movies. And he invited her, and it meant something to her. Like it included her in the group, as it were. And then later everyone else was invited. But she was the one that he invited first. Like he made that, something special for her. So, and then when we got to the movies, he told me to buy my wife a box of chocolates. Which I did. She gave it to Baba. And then Baba gave us all prasad. It was called The Man Who Never Was. It was a spy story in the Second World War, and they'd invented this mythical person to plant documents on him to mislead the other side. The British misleading the Germans. And they had a submarine, and they'd shoot the body out through the torpedo outlets, and they'd be found, documents would be found. It took we were there for about 50 odd minutes. And Baba, when we came in, when he first came to the theatre, we sat down in the foyer, and Robert Rouse was the one that was delegated to get the tickets. So he's doing his tickets. I was sitting here, and I've got an idea I was sitting at the other end of the van, but I'm not sure. But there was the theatre cat, the Persian cat, over there, and as soon as Baba sits down, it just makes a beeline to Baba and jumps up on his lap. And never looked at anyone else. And Baba strokes the cat. And Robert gets the tickets. And Baba says in its next incarnation that cat will be a human. And so, and we go upstairs, That's where he tells me to buy the chocolates. What else? There's something happened with Dr. Lee. I don't think what it was. He was the Francis Lee was the Bible lover and Dr. Lee wasn't. We got Dr. Lee to do something later. Then we went into the theatre and we booked three rows. And there was about 2 rows in front of us, then 3 rows of ours, and then there were a few people sprinkled in the theatre, not that many. But there's a fairly big group come in, and there's this strange looking Eastern man telling everyone where to sit. Must have been very unusual. And directing everyone where to sit. And he's sitting in the middle row. I'm sitting behind him, he's there, and I'm one to the side and one behind. I forget who was sitting beside me, but I'm pretty close to him. You can see what's going on. And so after some time, like the light slowly faded and the movie started. Then I just noticed him do one thing during that. He seemed to put on something dark over his head, which would probably black out his vision. And then just after a little while it was taken off. So then we're really starting to get interested in the picture, the moving picture. You call it movie, it used to call it picture. We now call it movie. But I'm old-fashioned. And Baba starts to leave. The whole group just get up and start to troop out, you see. Oh, she went out, yeah. But I'm one of the last, because I let the other rows go, and I'm one of the last to go out, and I hear this typical loud, typically Australian male voice say, "Who does he think he is? Jesus Christ," or somebody. So he picked it. Very loudly. I don't know that Baba heard it. I think most of them had gone. But yes, so that was funny. The emphasis the second time when Baba came to Avatar's Abode, the emphasis was completely different. And you could see the atmosphere was even a bit different, because you could see how much he'd suffered, and he was still suffering. And it was as though we were the witnesses. That's one of the reasons that we were there, just to witness it. And also, he emphasised to us the importance of obedience and the seriousness of obedience. Because even though before we had to realise that in love there was obedience, now the emphasis, the real emphasis was on obedience. It was very serious. And it was a requirement that there should be nobody there. There was only people children could be there if they're 9 or above, but no one was to be there that wasn't to stay the full time and wasn't prepared to be obedient to Baba. And we had to know how serious that obedience was, and then he spelled that out to us to the extent of asking one man, and you wouldn't know who he was going to ask, and he can read your mind, so it's a bit, feel rather naked. So he asked one man if he asked him to cut his wife's throat. So I thought for a while and I said, yes, Baba. And then he asked a boy, a teenage boy, if he could walk naked to school and punch the headmaster in the eye. And he said, I don't think I can, Baba. I don't think I could. And then there was a girl he asked to do something, and she wasn't sure, but I think she was going to try. And then they were individuals that he'd picked out. And I forget how many questions like that he asked, but it was emphasising the seriousness of it. It was to be the obedience of Abraham to God. And you wouldn't pledge that obedience to anyone else but God. You'd have to believe that they were a divine being, because you're risking your life pledging that type of obedience. You know, if it might be some nut, you know. Abraham might have been hearing voices and obeyed them, and might have just been, you know, published in stone tablet. Father runs amok, kills son or something, huh? Whatever. But then he asked who would be obedient to him. And he said, the things, I won't ask you to do any of those things, but what I will ask you to do will be just as difficult. So then he said, who will be obedient to me? Their hands, and there were 3 hands didn't go up. There was the man and 2 children. And Baba calls them up the front, and he asks the mother of the children, haven't you explained to your children that this was a requirement? And she said, I explained to them, Baba, but apparently I didn't explain adequately. So Baba stops the proceedings. Everyone is, if you can't obey him, you're supposed to leave. So he stops the meeting, and it gives people time to consider their position for about 10 minutes. So the mother can talk to the boys, and the man can talk to others or whatever. And so as the mother's getting up, she kind of gets a flash from Baba that he knows everything. So he wouldn't ask them to do anything that was wrong or harmful. So when she goes to explain to the children, she starts off saying that, well, Baba knows everything. And, oh, well, not if he knows everything, he knows everything. That's okay. So he was quite happy. But the man, he was an artist, and he didn't have really the background. Would have been better if he'd had more preparation. So what he was really annoyed that Baba could think of asking children to do those things and, as it were, frightening the children like that. And also he wasn't going to do it. So then, and Baba, he had a session with Baba, and he wasn't going to do it. It was all right. Baba said, "Now, do me a special favour. You needn't be obedient to me, but stay just as a special favour for me." He thought he'd accept that, and he was just going to go away, And he suddenly thought that, first of all, he felt that he'd won a point on Baba. And then he felt he might be missing something, that he'd tried to avoid things all his life, and now he might be missing something. So he came back and pleaded with Baba to let him be obedient. So Baba said, "Be obedient." Because it's not the same, really, is it? What do you think? Well, if you refuse, and then you're given something else, and then you want that changed, it's not the same, but it doesn't matter. It didn't concern me, but it's just a point that I was bringing out. It wasn't discussed then, and probably shouldn't have been now. But I was bringing out a point that it's best to not have things changed. If he says to do something, do it. Oh yeah, better than nothing. Better than nothing. Yeah, there's different levels. So then Baba told us about the different levels of obedience, different types of obedience, which you've probably all heard about. You got any questions? Any answers? Well, it appears as what he does is that he connects up your Sanskaras, your impressions, so that when you obey, you're going to have a whole lot of them wiped out through that obedience. And if you don't obey, it's rather disastrous for you, because they've all been linked up like that. And yeah, they're all there and brought to the surface or whatever, or all linked up. And they're already, that lot are all set up to be demolished. And if you don't obey, well, I don't know, but it seems as though you really suffer a hell of a lot, and suffer through those particular sense, and the particular ones that were going to get wiped out, they'll get emphasised then, because they were ready to be wiped out. It appears that way, but I don't know. Yeah. Like there was that story about the man in India that came. I think he was a Brahmin, and he wants to get instructions from Baba, or he'll do anything Baba tells him. So Baba tells him to drink, and go out with prostitutes, things like this. And, oh, but Baba, seriously, he's not taking it seriously. He thinks Baba's joking. And here he was, ready to obey Baba, if it was what he thought Baba should have said. And there's Erich thinking, oh my God, he's getting licensed to do what he likes. He's having his cake and eat it too. And here's this fellow, he's telling him, giving him a license to do all this, and he's not believing that he's serious. Oh, now seriously, Baba. And he's just ignoring the instruction. And so eventually Baba changes it and he says, well, go out for 2 years, wander around India, whatever. I've forgotten all the details, but... He said don't touch money, don't the conventionally acceptable thing, and he accepted that. But then... I was real happy about that. Yeah. But that later on, that one was the one that when they came back to this place where he lived, and this is years later, Erich asked about him, and I can't kind of speak about him, and apparently he was running a brothel or something like that. But the Sanskaras were there, and they hadn't been wiped out, and they came to the forefront then. Yeah.
Bob would have actually made him go out and do it. And it all would have been gone.
Well, it's really trying. Yeah, it's obedience. Yeah, it was obedience. That's right. Well, he came offering to be obedient, and then when he was told what to do, he just thought Baba was joking. It was so unacceptable to his traditional values that he just couldn't accept it. But that's what it's all about, really. That's why, the Master will say, or God said to Abraham, kill your son. It is an unacceptable traditional value, but it's the person's faith and trust and love for the Master that performs the miracle. Or the Master's working that wipes out the Sanskaras. So... Where's Baba? Actually, the last store was the gum trees that I hadn't seen many about before, but when we came here, this was the last store. I was feeling it felt very much like Sydney, but the last store was just seeing all the gum trees and the bush down here. Here we are. Feels very much at home. All the eucalyptus trees you have here. Yeah, well, they're a native of Australia, They're all over the world now, so everyone thinks that, they just grew there and that they're theirs, but they really come from Australia, yeah. We'll probably be getting some rare seeds back, there used to be hundreds of them, different varieties, and we'll probably, we'll need to get them back because we won't find any in Australia. They've chopped them all down or something. Well, it's a tendency everywhere, isn't it? It's the environmentalists are trying to do a good job and they're succeeding, meeting with some success, but it's pretty hard to stop big business. Why not? Yes, thank you very much.
They had a lot of eucalyptus trees up in Berkeley, here in the hills. They had a lot of them. And when I was last living there, they had a real cold, maybe 3 or 4 days, and they looked like they died out almost. But then they were growing. I wonder, did they show you any of them?
I didn't notice them, but they have, if they'd have taken them from the colder climate, like down near Kosciuszko, there'd be special ones that adapt to the cold and special ones that adapt to the heat, and they've got ones that just grow up very tall and long that, are good for making these posts and things like that, and then there's the mallee that, all sprawl all over the places. There's actually well, it wouldn't be above the freezing of the snow line, but they'd have them used to very cold climate, yeah. They've probably got snow gums, I don't know. But there's so many, there's hundreds of different names, varieties. I've got no idea how many, but there's, at least 300, probably more.
I had this vial of eucalyptus oil, and I was going in to Padre to get a homeopathic remedy, and he only chewed me out with a broom. He got so angry because I could have ruined all of it. They're real powerful.
Oh, it is very powerful. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. It's actually very good for a solvent if you get anything sticky on those labels or something that you can't get off or stick. If you use eucalyptus oil for that, you usually take it off. Mm. They've discovered another one now, which is tea tree oil, which is a natural germicidal. And it's very good. It's like the oil just extracted from the tea trees. Now they're starting to have tea tree plantations on the northern coast of New South Wales to extract the oil. When I was in town last, I hadn't been able to buy it, and I'd heard about it on the radio. And last time I was in town, I saw some in water bottle. And it works. No. So Chris could hear it again. Wait on. I might be able to think of one you haven't heard on the travelling side. You heard, which one did you hear last night on the travelling? You heard, the lady. And you also heard the one where I'll let Barbara organise it. The seat's vacant. Yeah, right. What's the other one? Did you hear the one where the airline was delayed? You might have heard that. Reg Paffel used to travel with me often. Well, Reg Paffel and I would often seem to travel together. Well, in the early days, the only way we could get concessions was to go as a group. Because if you were 15, they'd give you one free ticket and you could divvy it out yourself. So we went as a group of 45, well, we'd get 3 free tickets. So you could divide that up and it'd be a concession. So that's roughly what we'd do. We'd travel as a group. And that made it so that you could only go at a certain time and only for a certain time. We'd say 3 weeks at Amatithi or something. So we saw a few Amatithis. And anyway, because Reg and I suppose, were closer to the same age than others, we'd often room together. And so I'd been with Reg for a few times. And this was before Reg had his stroke. It must have been 1980, in February 1980. And I got very ill at work, and I retired due to illness, and the paperwork had to be finalised, and they were procrastinating with paperwork. So I can't remember whether we'd booked our seats early. One year we booked our seats early, so we bought a price rise, but I can't remember whether it was this year or not. Anyway, time came when Reg was definitely going, and he'd made a firm booking, and It was something like February I'll say the 8th or the 12th, 1980. And he came down. I was trying to get this paperwork finalised at work, and I was supposed to write a letter to me, and it was finalising everything. And they didn't. So Reg was coming down on Tuesday and departing on Tuesday, and the previous week they told me on Friday that they'd fixed everything up and I should get the letter on Monday, so Monday comes, I don't get it. Tuesday comes, and I think, well, I know Barbary, kind of, it's a bit of brinkmanship. I think I'll pack my bags just in case, just to be ready, because it might work out. He seems to work it out sometimes. So I packed my bags and had them all ready. Yet Tuesday came and I didn't get the letter. So now I can't go. So we ring up to make sure that the airline's going on time. And it's been delayed for 3 hours. So then just after, someone rings me from at work. I apologise for not having attended to the letter on Friday. And he says, I'll read you the letter now. And he says, I've got it in front of me, it's all typed out. So he reads me the letter, so it's tied everything up. And he says, I'm going to go out and put it in the post box now. So it took me I thanked him for that. And it took me, 5 minutes or so to wake up that I actually didn't have to have the letter in my hand. As long as I could trust him, and he'd do that. And why couldn't I? Because he'd read it out to me. He didn't know I was leaving or anything, so I thought, well, I really don't need the letter in my hand. If he's posted, it's all right. So I'll go. So I was able to ring up the airline and get a seat, and then we rang a taxi because I was already packed. And we caught the taxi and caught the plane. They had a spare seat and paid for it there. And I couldn't, there was only the fact that that aircraft had been delayed 3 hours that I was able to go. Will there be, is there anyone here that's not coming tonight that hasn't, you've heard my story, haven't you? Thank you. About testing Baba. Just the testing bit. phase, because it's like I thought you said India. India.
Water and land is big houses.
Mm. Mm. When I first met Baba, I'd actually been looking for a master for about 10 years. Not tearing around the world looking for one, but because there weren't many about. You know. Very thin on the ground. And I don't know about that. I only found one, but I found the right one. Might have taken 10 years, but and no wrong ones in between.
Yeah.
But that was the problem. See how to tell. There's a risk of life, don't you? It's obedience. And you'd be crazy not to try to find out whether you were genuine or not. I felt. So I had met him at the airport, and then I was driving back, but I only picked up the bags. That's why I went out there to pick up the baggage. The others had picked up Barbara and the Mandarin. And I was driving back by myself, so it gave me plenty of time to think. I was thinking how serious it was now that I had met my master. Eventually I'm going to be obedient. So how does one tell whether a master is genuine or not? So I previously figured out that one would just use the judgment at the time. But now's the time. So the only one I thought I could compare him with would be Jesus. I thought, Jesus. He would know what I was thinking. I gathered that from some of the occurrences in the New Testament. He knew what some of the people were thinking, saying anything. So he'd know what I was thinking. And I thought, well, what are the attributes of God? Attributes of God are truth and love. Now, I'll test him out. And he'd departed ahead of me at the airport, and by the time I got going, he turned around the corner, and I hadn't seen his car since then. And just as I think now I'm going to test him, there's his car. From here to the wall over there away, and in the next lane to mine. No cars in. And I thought, wow, I just decided I want to test him, and there he is. Well, I might as well test him. So, why wait? Get it over with. So, he had his back towards me, and it was kind of a bit hard to do. Anyway, you'll have to imagine it. So, I think Barbara's truth. Like this. Right on cue, you see. But of course, I think, oh, well, perhaps, someone saw me and said, oh, there's John Grant, just going, hi. Rationalising. So, anyway, but still, it might have been right. We better try again. Barbara's love. So, this gave me a bit of a shake, Our heart starts to pound, it's starting to get a bit exciting. What next? So, and I'm thinking, it's so precisely, there's not so much chance of this being coincidence. So I think, well, here goes. I brace myself. I get I'm in traffic and driving along, and all this is going on. So hang onto the wheel, and I think, fairly full concentration. Barbara is. He turns right round, and I thought, well, no, he has to be able to read my mind. He mightn't be the avatar, but he has to be able to read my mind. And then, even later, on discourse in the room, and I suppose I was being like a naughty little boy. Of course, knowing that Barbara could read my mind. It's about creation. So Barbara's wearing a pink coat. Completely. Anything that was spiritually significant, he would always acknowledge it. If I thought Barbara's truth, he'd give an instantaneous flash of his eyes. I can't do it, but he'd be looking somewhere else, and if I thought Barbara's truth, and he'd look towards me, and just instantaneously, and every time, Barbara's truth, Barbara's love, Barbara's God, anything like that, it just click every time he'd acknowledge it. So even without doing it that way, even just more silently, if you like, he would do it. And then, even later on, after he left, he'd really think about it and concentrate on it. He still seemed to acknowledge something. An involuntary welling up in the heart or something. You just feel something. At the time you had some thought of something that would be spiritually significant. That kind of thinking, like you mentioned about inner contact and inner feelings. These days it seems to be more like the voice of guidance, but that was like it was like a response to a question, an acknowledgement of something. But it was just like a natural progression of the first thing that I'd done. And he was perfectly happy to let people test him, and he could meet all the tests. He couldn't find any test that he could fail. Then carries responsibility. You've got to uphold him. The spiritual law says in discourses. So, test, or don't test. Some people don't need to test. I had to test. It was my nature. So, No. I didn't need to. I'd got my proof, as it were, within a month of his first visit, or about a month of his first visit. He'd given us an instruction to obey. And the instruction was that for 4 consecutive Saturday nights, at midnight, for half an hour, we were to be in a completely darkened room, and we were to have our eyes open and to repeat his name for half an hour. And a little incident happened before I started doing that, and it was just after Barbara left Australia in the first time, in 1956. And that was so it was probably either that day or the next day. It was probably that day. There was a few things to do, like cleaning up after he'd been there and so on. It wasn't the mad rush to get everything done before he came, but I suppose there was a bit of cleaning up and stuff to do after he departed. So I'd agreed to go up there on the next Saturday afternoon, and I wanted to go. But when it came, and I don't think the LePages had the telephone number. I think we did, but I don't think they did. But I'm not positive. But we couldn't ring them up for some reason or other. One of us didn't have one. So when my wife hears that I want to go up to Beacon Hill on that Saturday, she said, "Look, you've been going up there for weeks or months before Barbara came helping. You've been neglecting jobs here. Now, it's more important to start getting on with the jobs here." Quite logical. I can understand that. That's fair enough. But I'd promised them that I'd go up. And then I felt a bit silly driving up and saying, "Look, I can't come up to help you. I'm busy at home on Saturday because I'm already there." Couldn't ring them. So what do I do? So, and I feel I should tell them. Like, it's okay if I tell them. But I felt that I promised them that I'd be up there. So anyway, she keeps reminding me that there's no hurry up there now, and neglected things here, so on, so forth. And she's right, of course. So the long and the short of it was, I didn't go up, and I didn't tell them. And I started to do a job that needed to be done. It was to mix some concrete and put in a path. So about 3 years I'd had a double hernia operation. And it was successful, and after about 12 months I was able to lift weights and things and not worry about it. And I'd lifted cement bags before. Everything was all right. This particular day, when I lifted a bag, honk, and I had the hernia again. And you can't make a mistake with a hernia because it's a split in the muscle, and part of the intestine can protrude through. So you can feel it. And, you can't make a mistake. The layman can't be wrong with this so bad. So I'd previously had a truss before I had the operation. That was still there, so I hadn't recovered. So I put that on and I finished the job, but I associated this thing happening. I thought, that shouldn't have happened. Why did it happen? There's a lesson there somewhere. Because I've done that before, and there's a lesson there. So what's the lesson? The lesson is keep your word. I'd promised that I'd go up and help Francis, and I didn't. And I didn't tell him that I couldn't come. That would have been okay. I didn't tell him. I think, what a fool I've been. So, anyway, I have a talk to Baba. Now, I feel he's engineered this. And so, I tell him I'm sorry. I apologise to him for not keeping my word. And I tell him that I don't want to go to hospital, and that I don't think it's necessary. I had come to the conclusion that there were two sorts of miracles. One associated with the avatar of Christ. One sort is where he consciously initiates it and, raises the dead or something, whatever. And the other one is the type where it's initiated by the individual and not the person, not the avatar. The individual has such conviction in the person and the being, personality of the avatar, that that person's faith and conviction performs the miracle. And that's what I'd figured out. And I said to Baba, I don't want to go to hospital again to have that operation. I believe this has been associated with you, and I was wrong. I did the wrong thing, and I've learnt my lesson. And I'm not going to hospital again. And I believe that you're the avatar, and that I believe that where my faith in you will cure me. And I said, in your time, I didn't set a deadline on it, in your time. And so that was it. And I felt as a kind of a little acknowledgement of it, as though a little kind of electrical energy went through my body at the time. That's what I'd said, and that was my attitude. I'd been wrong, I'd apologised, it was associated with him. Now I had faith in him, that it would be cured for him in his time. That's it. I didn't bother thinking about it anymore. Forgot about it. Didn't bother thinking, wonder when this is going to happen or anything. Just went about my business. So if I had heavy work to do, I'd wear a truss. If I didn't, I wouldn't. So his instructions were about the darkened room. So I made sure that that room would be, I made particularly certain that it would be darkened. Because I figured out that if the person gets on the first plane, is going to be given a glimpse of something, you see subtle plain things with the gross eyes. So if you're blacking something out, so if you can't see anything with the gross eyes, you're going to have the best chance of seeing anything that might be there on the subtle plane. Now, I don't know whether that was right or not. To me, it seemed to be a good reason. Now, if you didn't blacken it out properly, you give yourself less chance. So that was why. Other than just to be obedient to him. He said a completely darkened room? Right, completely darkened room. So you've no idea how difficult it is to darken a room. So I made blackout screens. I used the bathroom and I made the laundry for my wife. Blackened out 2 rooms. Midnight. To midnight 30 to 12:30. So I blacked out the windows. I'd try it out on a night there, and I'd have to put something under the door, even the keyhole. Then there were the ventilators in the wall. I had to cover them, and I'd try it out, and for 5 minutes it'd be okay, but then 10 minutes, your eyes get used to the dark and it starts to get light. And there was it had a ventilator ceiling that had ventilators in it in the bathroom so that the air would go out. So I thought, block that up with bags. Even when there'd be no moon, after a while, just the stars. After about 10 minutes, it'd start to look bright. And so, anyway, it kept having to do more and more and more to blacken out the keyhole and everything. So eventually, I got it, satisfied with it. It was blacked out. So then, the first night came. That was the night after. It was a Saturday night. I think it was the night after that. I'm not sure. It was either that or next week. But he'd given us a date to start, so it was probably that date. I'm not sure. So I started. Got my eyes open. Repeating Baba's name. It was to be repeated. The way he told us to repeat his name was Baba, 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 Baba. It wasn't MeherBaba's name. So whenever he's told us to repeat his name and shown us how, it's Baba, Baba, Baba. And even though it's a common name meaning father, when we're talking to our father, we don't think of all the other fathers in the world. We just think of our own father. So when I say Baba, it's my Baba. It's not, even though it's not a common name to me. People might ask that, I don't know, but that's how I feel about it. It's a particular one to me. So, Baba. And nothing much happened. Sometimes seemed to be little kind of little speckles of light, some luminescence, or not much at all. I don't know what. So you could say nothing much happened at all. First night we had to do it 4 Saturdays. Nothing. Pretty uneventful. Last night, in the last minute and a half hour, and all of a sudden, there was like a great amount of energy just seemed to through my body and down through my body to this area where the hernia was. And as it went through my stomach, I felt a pinch. And I'd had a bit of trouble. I think I might have had, the start of an ulcer. I'm not sure. But it was just like a little pinch. Like that. And you could feel a pinch. And then down here where the hernia was, pinch. And all this great, I was filled with great energy. And that was it. My hernia was, I haven't had a hernia since. It cured my hernia. And there was only one person to me that he could have been to do that, and that's the Avatar. So I was convinced from then on he was the Avatar, because, I might be wrong, but to me, he's the only one in the world that could do that. At that distance, I'm in India talking to him, I'm in Australia talking to him in India. And I never realised, for years later, never realised that it was done in his time. It was the last minute of the time that was reserved for carrying out an instruction from him. And I guess that was his time. And it never occurred to me that that was the kind of condition that I'd said. I wasn't putting a time on it. It was up to him in his time. But then what actually happened was it was done literally in his time. In that time that had been specially reserved for him. And that never occurred to me. For, I don't know, 10, 20 years. Never occurred to me. I think it was probably when I was writing the book. The penny drops or something, I don't know. But it never occurred to me until, more recently. So, I don't know what conviction I needed or what what tests I needed, but that was the final convincing thing for me that it couldn't be anyone else than who he claimed to be if that could happen.
It sort of comes over like again and again and it gets approved.
Mm.
And then of course I go back to the
Thank you, Baba. All this act here wouldn't have been possible without you, Baba. None of us. We're just the puppets.
You made me feel just like I'm in Queensland.
Right.
Looking out of this window.
You'll have to come. Just the sea's down there. That reminds me something of Bondi or something, looking out there. Yeah. So, and it takes you a long time to decide whether you share these things with people or not. I was a very kind of private person. Play the cards close to my chest, as it were. One of the biggest, I suppose, shocks, in a way, after I'd had the book published and printed, and see, when it was published and printed, I had all the copies. And, I hadn't seen them sold anywhere. Come to India and I've got some copies there. One day I saw a copy that someone must have bought in the shop. And there it was. Actually, I wasn't very pleased about it. Because suddenly I realised that anybody could buy that book that had parts of my life in it, my kind of private life, my innermost thoughts, there it is. It wasn't one of mine, it had been sold, someone else had sold it and someone else had bought it. I saw it at the Pilgrim Centre somewhere then. I get this shock. You know, I feel naked. Whatever, a few dollars, I'm a secretive person, My God, so, what a change, but it was a shock, it really shocked me, I hadn't thought of that before. Plunk. What have you done, my lad? You'd think I'd feel pleased about it, but no way. I felt shocked in a way. So I guess I'll never be the same again.
The cat's out of the bag. You say that in Australia, the cat's out of the bag.
Something like that, yeah. However, fortunately, I kept a couple of secrets. No way. Well, most Baba lovers have things associated with Baba, something that they won't tell you. So, yes, they won't even share the little ones, let alone the big ones. Yes, anyway. Is that it? Enough?
Sure. We should probably get going to sell.
All right, okay. I'll switch that thing off.
Welcome to the Avatar MeherBaba Center of Southern California. If you're new to the center, we do have free literature downstairs that gives you information about MeherBaba. We have the universal message in English.
Archie Goodwin. I have my Archie Goodwin hat tonight. But I thought what would be really nice is maybe we have just a couple of moments of silence, and then I have a couple of messages, and then I'll break the silence with a quote from Baba. So, hey Baba. MeherBaba said in Myrtle Beach in 1956, I am the Ancient One, the one residing in every heart. Therefore, love others, make others happy, serve others, even at discomfort to yourself. This is to love me. I suffer for the whole universe. I must suffer infinitely. Unless I suffered, how could I ask my lovers to suffer for others? I am one with all on every level. I am one with all on every plane of consciousness. And I am beyond all planes of consciousness. For those of you who may not know, Bob Brown, the Baba, and maybe I'll still do that.
Mark, the other person who's sick right now is Nancy Merwan. Just had both of her hips yesterday.
One
One at a time. Worked on and replaced. And she's in either Sinai Hospital.
Jiva was raised.
Just a loving. While we're making announcements, I did forget one, Mark, and then I'm going to let you wear your hat.
Yes.
What?
Nero always puts AG and usually NW at the end. So, it says MB. Okay, well, we'll see what it says. AG, meaning Archie Goodwin. This evening's program was scheduled to be about one of Baba's favorite things, Nero Wolf. However, we can at any time pay a visit to the old brownstone on West 35th Street. But another Baba said to say, I thought you were a musician, John.
Next incarnation.
Next incarnation. But another Baba said to say is John Grant. And I am honored that Baba has chosen this night to bring John from our Australian Baba family to share his music to the beloved of all and to acquaint us with their activities down under. Right? Kangaroo Bada from Australia Farm. So, I will introduce John by saying good night. John first met Baba on his first trip to Australia in 1956. Am I right, sir? And he has recently completed a really fine book called Practical Spirituality, which is really quintessential Baba. And you know, by the way, we have John here. If you don't have a copy, get a copy and get him to autograph it. So anyway, without any further ado, beloved Baba's John Grant.
About the uniqueness of Avatar's Abode first, and let you think about that. The three places of world pilgrimage associated with MeherBaba, they are the Ahmednagar area, Myrtle Beach, and Avatar's Abode in Australia. The area at MeherBaba was developed under Baba's direct personal supervision, and Myrtle Beach was developed under his direct instructions, but more or less by remote control, with him being physically absent. But if they had any query or wanted to make a decision on something important, they would communicate with Baba externally. And they were the two centres that were planned early in the piece. And when Baba came to Australia, there was a little bit of a kerfuffle about his invitation to Australia and his decision to come to Australia. And I'm sure that it was just to teach us all a lesson about whether we should ask the Master to do something. And the circumstances were that Ena Lemon and Clarence Adams went to India in 1956 in February. They met Baba. He had a darshan at Arnavas Chanzi's home in Bombay, and they were there for 2 days, and they saw Baba on both days. And when they were coming home, Clarence had gone by air and Ena had come by ship, and there was no ship available immediately then, so they had to make an air booking for her, and she had a little bit of time to talk with Maggie. And she heard that MeherBaba was visiting the West and coming to America, and she asked, which way is he going home? And I said, oh, via the Pacific, Honolulu. Oh, she said, that's almost to Australia. What do you think of coming to Australia? And Maggie said, call him, and invite him. So she was encouraged to do this by Maggie. And when she came home, she thought that, well, on the way, she thought that, well, Francis Brabazon was the head of the group, and it would be the right thing to do to allow Francis, to tell Francis about it, and allow Francis to invite MeherBaba to Australia. And this is what she did. But Francis didn't want to invite MeherBaba to Australia. His understanding of the Master was that you don't ask for anything. That when the Master wants to do something, the Master will do it. And it will be the right thing at the right time, at the right place. But if you ask for something and the Master gives it to you, as he often will, because you ask for it, then it is not the same. So he had that very firm conviction. But on the other side of it, Ina lived in Melbourne, and when she went back to Melbourne, she mentioned it to all the people there, and they were so enthusiastic about it, and even MeherBaba's one of his own Mundley had encouraged her to invite him. So she invited him herself. And he responded and said that he would come to Australia. But, first of all, Francis Brabazon must be told about it and considered. So now Francis could no longer remain silent. He had to let us know his feelings, and he did in a letter to all the Barber community. And he asked us to consider this question, and should we write to Barber and asking him to disregard the request for him to come to Australia, and if he wanted to come to Australia, to wait until when he wanted to come, and not to come because he was asked to come. And so we all received this letter, and of course there were many emotions within each one, mixed emotions, because many of us had known about MeherBaba for a long time, and were dying for the time when he would come to Australia, when we could meet him. And yet it seemed to be rather reasonable what Francis was coming up with, and yet also it was quite reasonable what Ina had come up with. And we knew which one we would like. So then a letter came after about a fortnight, after we'd had time to individually stew on the matter. A letter came from Barber telling us that now it was his decision to come to Australia. And he was not coming because he was requested to come. So that was the background to the first visit. And the second visit, as you know, there had been a visit planned to India in November 57, and he'd had the car accident and was unable to hold that meeting. And then it was announced that there would be a combined meeting in February 1958, if possible, that maybe his health wouldn't be good enough, which it wasn't. And so then it was announced that the Eastern meeting would be held in February 58, and the Western meeting would be held at Myrtle Beach and in Australia. So there had been no place named in Australia. There had been a place at Mayor House, which Francis Brabazon had built for MeherBaba to be a centre. But then when we got the details of this visit, we find out that Baba's preference is for Queensland. Now, there were no Baba lovers in Queensland. Most of us had never been to Queensland. And we wondered why, but because he had expressed a preference. And then he said it was okay if we held it at Beacon Hill, where it had been held before. That was quite all right. But if we could afford to hold it in Queensland, and provided we met certain conditions, and one of the conditions was that it was not too far away from a centre of population, and another condition was that it was not too close, and if we could afford to hold it, and if the group could assemble there, then he would prefer Queensland. So it was up to those individuals at that time to decide whether they would do the easy thing to hold it in Sydney, where it had previously been held, or there was only 4 months in which to organise it, to go to Queensland, find a suitable place, buy the place, get the place ready for his visit. So because he had expressed a preference, it was immediately decided that we would find a place in Queensland. So Francis Brabazon set off, Francis had chosen the right place. And then he named the place Avatar's Abode. And he went into the details of actually who owned it very minutely. He asked who owned the property, and Francis said, "You, Baba." Baba said, "In whose name is the property?" "Oh, it's in my name, but we had difficulty transferring to you and you're in India, but we can transfer it now." So Baba probed and found out exactly the details of the property. Thank you. And then accepted the property, then told Francis to keep it in his name for the time being, and then he named the property, and then later he said that that place would become a great place of pilgrimage. So the 3 places associated with Meher Baba in the world have different backgrounds. So I just thought I'd like to tell you the difference between Avatar's Abode and the others. At that time, there weren't any plans. Meher Baba didn't instruct us what to do with Avatar's Abode. And there were people playing more of a caretaking role, of people, 2 families on the property, they were allowed to farm the property. And he didn't give any specific instructions for its development at that time. And so, just as all the way through his time he was emphasizing the inner contact, the external contact was just to make the initial contact, and then the real contact to be developed was the inner contact. So I believe that this is what we're having at Avatar's Abode, that the development will be done intuitively through people's inner contact with Meher Baba. And if there's any problems, it'll just be people working off their impressions and grinding egos away and so on. And it will all turn out how he wanted it to finish. And it's quite an exciting prospect to think that he's still very active in that area. So I just wanted to point that part out. And there's an anniversary, the 30th anniversary of his visit to Avatar's Abode next June, and you're all invited to come. Now, there was another topic, and I think I should tell you how I came to write a book about Meher Baba. And the book that I'm speaking about is this one, Practical Spirituality with Meher Baba. And I first met Meher Baba in 1956, and the first day that we had an all-day session, I was so impressed with his presence and his discourses that I remembered 4 of the discourses, and I wrote them down from memory, 3 at lunchtime and 1 later, that same day. And I took notes, but I never ever thought that I'd be writing a book. I expected Francis Brabazon to do it, or someone else, because I wasn't an author. And then, as time went on, no one seemed to do the needful, and I was busy in my work, and then I started to realise that someone needed to do something. So in about 1976 I wrote to all the adults that had been there and asked them for any information that they could contribute. And I got 2 replies, about 4 or 5 pages of information, which I was glad to get. And when I mentioned Mahazad, Balna too said how lucky I was that he'd only got 1 reply. So, everything's relative. So it's quite right. So it wasn't that people didn't want to cooperate, but I found that when I'd take a tape recorder somewhere and start on the topic, and I'd remind them of something that happened, well, that'd jog their memory, and then soon the memories would come. And also I'd try to get other people involved in this. If I was living in Sydney and someone was at Avatar's Abode, I might be able to get someone to tape record a meeting at Avatar's Abode. So I was collecting information about the 2 visits and only thinking that that was what I would publish, because the visits hadn't been completely written up. There'd been something about them, but there was much to be desired to be written. And I also had a few little personal experiences that I think every Baba lover has. They're so personal, sometimes you don't want to share them, but I was prepared to share some. And then when I went down to Melbourne to visit, to give the people the opportunity of the people whose homes Meher Baba had visited in Melbourne, the opportunity of telling their story. Then while I was there, I found out that Ina Lemon and Clarice Adams, they told me their stories of their visit to Baba earlier in the year, in 1956. And it seemed as though I was writing about Baba's visits to Australia, so I thought that was an appropriate one. Then it seemed to need a background, so I wrote a background, and the Sufis, there was a Sufi link there, and that seemed to be part of the background. And so on, and then there was the time between the 2 visits, and then I realised that I'd been put in a very unique position. I'd been to the so-called last Savas, and when I was going over on the way over, I bought a tape recorder of many tapes, and I had a fairly comprehensive record of the last Savas. And I had actually seen Meher Baba withdraw his means of communication, first of all, or change his means of communication, not withdraw them, change them. First of all, he would communicate by speech, and then he withdrew speech and changed over to writing. And then he withdrew the writing and started to use the alphabet board, and then withdrew the alphabet board and started to use hand gestures, facial gestures, eye gestures. And then he arranged this wonderful meeting with all the details, the times, the exact times, the dates when people from all over the world would be there to share his company, to be in his presence. And then he withdrew the human body, the means of communication with his hands and his face and his eyes. And as it was the last time that I could honour his invitation to come to India, and also that he said that I must come to India earlier, but then released me from that, I wanted to go, irrespective of what happened. And I was sure that it was completely planned, and it wasn't by chance that he had withdrawn the body. And I wanted to be there to see what would happen, because I thought there would be something very special happen. And I didn't know what it was. And sure enough, when I got there and went to Guru Prasad on the first day, There was something very special there. His presence could be more powerfully felt there in his physical absence than I had ever experienced it in his physical presence. And there were other people there who had never met him physically, and they were experiencing that presence in his physical absence. And that said a lot to me, that his message had been continually emphasizing the inner contact. It was always available. And here he had clearly demonstrated. He told us early in the piece that the important thing was longing. Love and longing. Longing was the thing. And he had, by his life and his actions, created these situations for us to long for him. And he put off the meetings many times and changed the dates to create this feeling of longing. And this was what greatly helped. Our remembrance and longing greatly helped to develop that inner contact. And the same principles and the same method is available today to anyone who's just hearing of him for the first time, to develop that inner contact. And I've explained all this in the book. I think I got perhaps a little bit carried away there, but it wasn't just a book about Australia. It continued on this theme, where originally I just meant to write about his visits to Australia. But then I went to India so many times later with tape recorder still, and recorded so many of Erich's talks and messages where he'd explain the significance of this or that thing, which we didn't always understand at first. And then there would be, with Meher Baba, was his life. His life would appear to be a series of living parables where he wouldn't always explain the parable, but time would unfold it. And so at Meherazad often these living parables of Meher Baba would be unfolded with the help of Erich and different Mandali members. And then I thought of what people should do, what guidelines people should have if they were coming to Baba today, because the same opportunity is there. The fact that he's not in the body is immaterial, and his presence can be experienced on a personal basis for the 100 years after he's dropped the body in this incarnation. So what a wonderful opportunity it is now. It's the time that is most spiritually significant for the next 700 years, this very time now. And I've listed the things that people should do if they want to get a better inner contact with Meher Baba today. And that's the book. Now, if you like, I'll tell you how I came. We all love hearing how I came to Baba stories, so I better tell you mine while I'm here. When I was about 4.5 years old, I had polio in the right leg and both arms. They were completely paralysed. So this probably stopped me playing sport as a child. I wasn't able to go to school until I was about 8, until I was 8. So this probably prevented me from getting more interested in sport and less interested in spiritual matters. But be that as it may, then there was a war, And by tradition, we seem to go to war without much provocation. And I tried to get into the armed services during the Second World War, and I couldn't. So I had done a radio course to have a skill so that I could get into the Air Force. And even the second time I tried and I stood next to the doctor so that he wouldn't see my gammy leg, he caught me in the finish and I didn't get away with it. So then I went to sea. And it was on one of these trips I was coming back from South America and called into Auckland. And I needed some reading material. And couldn't find anything in this second-hand bookshop. Incidentally, I should have added that I had a Christian background and I was very interested in the life of Jesus, but I didn't find it very interesting the way the church taught it, and they didn't seem to be living his teachings. But I thought that his life was wonderful. So I couldn't find any book in the second-hand bookshop that I would like to read. So just as I'm going out, there's a book in a brown paper cover there on the shelf. So curiosity kills the cat. So I take the book and open it up. It's a book on Raja Yoga. Never heard of it. This is 1945. So I sort of opened up the contents page and attention, concentration, perception, willpower. I thought this looked pretty good. I'll buy this book. So I bought it and took it back to the ship and started to read it. And it was an unusual book because there'd be the chapter and the topic, a summary of the chapter, and then a mantra to repeat. So I started off in the first chapter and I'd just read the first chapter. And you'd read it every day. And then after a few days you didn't need to read it all, you could just read the summary. And it would come back to you, repeat the mantra. And I realised that I should have had 2 books before I read this one in order to give me the background necessary for what I was doing, because I didn't understand some of the things. And it occurred to me that one's mind could go out and then suddenly flip over. You mightn't be able to get it back. I had never heard anything about musts or anything like that, but that thought occurred to me. I thought, well, I better be very careful, but if I just take it easy, it'll be all right. So I probably got up to about chapter 3 or maybe 4. And one night I was on duty from midnight till 4. And I came off duty at 4 o'clock and get into my bunk, switch out the light and close my eyes. I wasn't asleep, I had only been there for about 30 seconds, and I saw this bright light. It was as bright as looking at the sun, but it wasn't a small object in the sky, it covered the whole of my visual horizon. And a very loud voice said, "John Grant." And all I could think of was that it was the voice of God. And I hadn't been particularly good that day. And I wasn't particularly wanting to meet him. So I opened my eyes and it went away. And I was rather relieved. And so I put on the light and sat up in bed. Would have thought I'd have had enough light, but... So I associated that with saying the mantras. So I resolved not to say the mantras anymore until I had more background information and also until I had a living master. So But I did get the books that I should have had before, which explained to me about the subtle world, the world of energy, and also the mental world, the world of mind. And by the same author of these books, there was a translation of the Bhagavad Gita. And that was the first time that I had seen this idea of Lord Krishna was saying to Arjuna, when the wick of righteousness declines in the world, then comes he, the Lord, and rekindles righteousness, and by his example. And many times in the past has he come, and many times in the future will he come again. And it just seemed to me as though this had happened in the past. It was just what had happened. And there'd just been an atomic bomb dropped, or two, one in Hiroshima and one in Nagasaki. And I thought, well, if he's not here now, there's no point in him coming, because he has to be here now. There's such a change happened, and such a man has control of so much more energy now than he ever had. It would need his guiding hand. So I felt sure that he was here somewhere, but I didn't know where. But I felt that he should be here. So then I had a friend who was a theosophist, and he gave me a book, The Light of Asia, by Edward Arnold, which is the story of the Buddha. And then I found in the State Library some books on Vedanta. And this was really a good insight, because about up to this point I was getting most of the external type of religion and not the inner teachings. And now I suddenly started to come across the inner teachings, which is really something wonderful and new. And then my father-in-law had met Baron von Frankenberg, who was the head of the Sufi group, and had offered to introduce me, but at the time I wasn't interested. And then there was another time when he had arthritis. He had arthritis and was crippled. He needed crutches, but he could drive a car, but not for long distances. So he sometimes would go to Melbourne, 600 miles away, so I'd drive him down and come back. And one time we were going about 30 miles out of Sydney, and Pop seemed to start a sentence in the middle of an idea, and by the time I'd unravelled what he was talking about, about 5 miles along the path, and he'd mentioned, that road over there. What he was meaning was that he had a hand loom in the back of the car, and he would like to give it to the Baron von Frankenberg, and the turn-off was about 5 miles back there. So we didn't bother going back. But that's how the little links that were there with Sufism. And so, and that was the first one was about 1947, and perhaps 1949, the second one. And then about 1954 I was getting a tyre changed at a service station in Manly, a Sydney suburb, and I was talking to the foreman. It must have been my attitude, just suddenly out of the blue. He says, "I think you'd be interested in Sufism." I said, "Oh, yes, well, I don't know anything about it." So he tells me more about it, and he says, "There's a meeting held every Thursday night at Betty Stosnoff's place in Cremorne." Yes. I said, "I'll take you along there." Now, if he hadn't offered to take me along there, I probably wouldn't have gone. But he was perhaps a bit more informative than my father-in-law, because he didn't know much about it, and so he couldn't convey to me really what it was about. So I went along to this meeting, and there I discovered the books of Inayat Khan, and they were just equally as good as the Vedanta books, because they were the inner teachings. And I really loved them, and there were more of them, so I really enjoyed reading them. And it helped fill in a lot of background information, because Baba wouldn't always explain himself. He's a bit slippery. You had to, be aware and hang on to him, or he'd try and shake you off. So, Inayat Khan was most helpful, helping me to become aware of who Meher Baba was, and he even gave signs by which you could recognise the avatar. And then at the same house I met Francis Brabazon. He was not conducting Sufi classes. By this time he had inherited the leadership of the Sufi movement in Australia, and he was not conducting Sufi classes, but the books were freely available. And Francis, as I got to know him, at that time he'd worked with a stonemason for about 6 months. He bought in 1949 2 blocks of land that were practically all Sydney sandstone, and he learned how to cut the sandstone and make building blocks out of it, sometimes big ones, about half as big as that box. And you'd see this little man, Francis, being able to manoeuvre these big blocks by balance. He'd get one end lifted up and then he'd roll it over some other object like this, and it'd go over like that with balance. And you'd wonder how he'd ever move it from there to there, but that's how he did it. And then every Saturday night he would give a talk, and he'd talk for over an hour on a spiritual master, a different spiritual master. There'd be a lot of Sufi masters, but also others like Milarepa and St. Francis of Assisi. And so it was a wonderful background, and you'd hear some of the stories of how the masters would test their disciples and things like this, and how they'd often want obedience. It seemed to be a big thing. And then he'd tell us about Meher Baba. And also at this time, the discourses of Meher Baba were available, and so I read the discourses. And of the topics that he wrote about that I was familiar with, such as lust, greed, anger, he seemed to explain them or describe them so perfectly. But then there were other things that I didn't understand, like Sanskaras. They were foreign to my culture, and so I thought he's so accurate describing the things that are within the orbit of my experience that I want things that I haven't experienced or am ignorant of. So I'll keep an open mind, but I'll watch what happens and see if what he says about Sanskaras is correct. And what he said about them was certainly correct, as I know now. But then Ina Lemon and Clarence Adams went to India, and Baba came to Australia, or was invited to come to Australia, and then decided to come to Australia himself. So one of the messages that came back with Ina and Clarence was that it was an incident that happened while they were there. There was a noise going on outside, and Baba says to Clarence, "Can you hear that noise?" And she says, "Yes, Baba." Baba says, "If you loved me, you couldn't hear it. But you can't do that. So the next best thing would be to think of me all the time." You can't do that. So it would be good if you could just think of me now and then. But maybe you can't even do that. So if you do this, if you repeat my name for a fixed period of time every day, the time between half an hour and an hour, and there's no love in repetition. But because I say so, it will bring love. And this was the message that Baba had given them, and just a little feminist bit, Betty Stoltenoff had asked Ina to ask Baba for a special message for the women of Australia. So when she did this, Baba said, I have already given it to you. So it was for the people of Australia. So it was the same message. And it's really for the people of the world. It wasn't just for Australia. So I started to do this, and I thought the best time to do it, it took me 35 minutes minimum time to get to work. So I thought I'll make the time 33 minutes. So I couldn't do it in 33 minutes, so that was okay. So and that wouldn't interfere with my family because they weren't Baba lovers, and it wouldn't take any time from them. So I did this every day, and it would be for about 4 months, I suppose, before Baba came. And I noticed, before I'd read anything about it, that there was a power in the name. Because, say I'd be driving along and I'd see a beautiful damsel, and I would normally have had lustful thoughts. I didn't have them when I was repeating his name. And I noticed this difference. And I noticed that it was the power in his name. And I later read that the repetition of his name, it's like putting alum into dirty water. It purifies the mind at that time, and the impressions sink to the bottom. So about a few days before Baba came to Australia, I was driving my car in a suburb called Redfern, just coming up a hill, and there was a long line of cars, then a brake, then a policeman on a motorbike. Nothing coming in the other way, and the policeman was dawdling there, and I thought, oh, I'll go in front of him. I get a beam of him, and everything, suddenly the time seems to change. As someone comes out of a side street at a great rate of knots, and everything stops in that lane in front of the policeman, and I can't get behind him because he's going so slow, so I've got to get in front of him and, almost cut him off just to get in there to get out of the way of the other traffic. And it seemed to be a bit of a setup, It didn't seem to be right. I felt a bit suspicious of it. I couldn't have been that wrong in the first place to have thought I could pass him and get in there, and all this happened so quickly. So, anyway, I could see him kind of glaring at me in the rear vision mirror. He's going to get me, I'm sure. So he says, all right, driver, pull into the side. So I pull in, and he says, your number plates are stone damaged. Now, you're supposed to have perfect number plates, which hardly anyone has. But if they're stone damaged, you're not to repaint them. So, and if you're told to, you must get them changed. So he made me change, said, get your number plates changed. So, yes sir, 3 bags full. So I went along to the Manly motor registry office, got a screwdriver out and took my plates off and gave them to them and said, the police have ordered me to change these number plates. And if you're changing them yourself, you've got to pay for them, but if the police order you, you don't. So then I had to sign for the new number plates, and I get the new number plates, and the new number plate was, you were only allowed in those days to have 3 letters and 3 figures. So it was B, A, B, 4, if it had another leg there it would be an A, 3, 2. All the numbers added up to 7. So everyone said, where did you get your Baba number plate from? I hadn't done anything. I didn't organise a Baba number plate. I just repeated his name in the car for 4 months. But that explained that kind of setup with the time speeding up, So, anyway, when Meher Baba first arrived in Australia a few days later, Francis had us very well disciplined. We weren't all to come out to meet Meher Baba at the airport. Most people had to stay and be at Beacon Hill there, ready to meet him, but not be seen and not be peeking through the windows. And so a few of us went out to meet him and take the Mundley back. And I was out there to pick up his baggage, or the baggage for the Mundley and Baba. But somehow or other, some people from Melbourne had come up who hadn't been so well organised. They come to the international terminal. So there were about 15 people, Baba lovers, there to meet him. So this is a great throng of humanity. It was before they had all these rails where they'd keep the arriving passengers from the public. So when the doors opened and Baba comes through, a great sea of humanity seems to open and aisles formed, and Baba walked down and, he'd touch one on the shoulder and the other one on the cheek, and he'd touch each one that was there to meet him, and he never missed one. And even when they were in the second row, he'd touch them. And no one was telling him who they were. And he touched everyone. I was up at the end, and I was just amazed at him being able to pick them out. So then he went to have an interview, it was a newspaper interview, and we started to get the baggage and put it into the cars, and then Baba was whisked away in Bill the Page's car, and Mundley and other cars, and I was the last car, and they'd all turned around the corner by the time I got off. I didn't see Baba's car anymore, and here I'd met the master that I'd been looking for. They were pretty thin on the ground in those days, and so he was really the first master that I discovered. And he claimed to be the avatar. So I wanted to be sure that he wasn't fake, because I was going to have to promise to be obedient to him. So you wouldn't want to be obedient to every Tom, Dick and Harry. It'd have to be God. So these were my feelings. So this is all right when you haven't got a master. Right, now's the time that you've got to test him. So this is my predicament. So how do you test a master? If it were Jesus, he would know what I was thinking. I'd gathered that from the occurrences in the New Testament, the Bible. So I decided, what are the attributes of God? The attributes of God are truth and love. So I decided that I will test Meher Baba. And just at that moment, I was coming out from Clarence Street to the approach of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And I just decided I'm going to test Meher Baba. And there he is in his car. In the next lane, about from here to that back wall away from me. So I thought, well, just decided to test him. Why not now? So I thought, looking at him, Baba is truth. turns around and gives me the sign of perfection. I reasoned that, well, probably someone told him that I was there. My car was just behind his car or something, you see. So I thought it would be impossible for him. It must have been a coincidence. So I thought, Barbara is love. Right on cue. Perfect timing. So this gave me a bit of a shake-up because the old heart started to pound, and it really was powerful medicine, powerful stuff. So it seemed as though he really was reading my mind, or it seemed pretty... Anyway, I'm going to test him again. I brace myself this time. It's in traffic and I'm hanging onto the steering wheel rather tightly. And I think with full concentration, Barbara is God. Very precise and emphatic. And so I came to the conclusion that he could read my mind. So, anyway, the events were to prove this, because later, when I should have been paying attention to a discourse given by MeherBaba, I was behaving like a naughty boy. I'd be thinking, knowing if he could read my mind, I'd think, MeherBaba is wearing a pink coat, which he was. He'd ignore it. But if I thought something that would be spiritually significant, such as MeherBaba is truth, MeherBaba is love, or MeherBaba is God, he would always acknowledge it with an instantaneous flash of his eyes. I cannot do it myself. I can't give that instantaneous flash. But he'd be looking every which way, but as soon as you had that thought, flash. And he would never ignore it. He'd always acknowledge it. And so I realised that he knew what I was thinking. And so the first day that he was there, that was the most important day at all-day session. And he welcomed us all to the Savas. We were introduced to him, embraced by him. And he said, "This is a Savas." And what is a Savas? A Savas is the intimate sharing of company between a master and his lovers. It's like the members of one family, and I am the head of that family. And all that I may say to you may not always be agreeable to you. Sometimes I may have to scold you, but it is for your own good and ultimate benefit. And he said that you being with me and my being with you do not mean the same thing. For ages and ages I have been closer to you than you feel your very self to be. And now this is your opportunity to be with me for a few days and to come closer and closer to me for all time. And he told us who he was, that he had been Rama and Krishna and Buddha and Jesus and Muhammad, and now he was MeherBaba. And that this each time he came to suffer for humanity, and that this body that we saw was just the veil, the garment, and we weren't seeing his reality. And then he told us about creation, which was like a mini God speaks, and then he told us about human love and divine love. And he emphasized that we shouldn't worry, that it's very dissipating of energy. He asked Francis how old he was, and Francis said 49. He said, we'll say 50. He said, 50 years ago you did this and that, you cried, and worry began in you. Now it's quite possible that in 50 years' time you could be worrying about something that happened now. He said, you've been everything. You worry about your wife, you've had so many wives. You worry about your children, you've had so many children. You know, they've had so many wives and children, and you've been everything and done everything. And yet you worry about the least little thing that happens to you. It's crazy. How to stop? Think of me. Love me. Jesus said with divine authority, your sins are forgiven. I say with divine authority, love me and your worries will vanish. And when it came to be my turn, Baba was sitting about this height on a divan, and there was a chair beside him. And I sat down on the chair, and he put his arm over my shoulders. And I didn't wish to ask him anything because his presence seemed to be so all-fulfilling, answering every question. And after a little time, I just felt waves of love breaking over my shoulders and over my being, just one after the other, emanating from his person. And I just stayed there until 5 minutes was up, and I had to go, I had to leave. The emphasis at that time was on love at that meeting. And we weren't allowed to sit on the fence. We had to commit ourselves. Eventually came the question, who is prepared to love me? And in love is obedience. And most people put up their hands, and someone hadn't. And they were asked why they hadn't put up their hand. And they said that they weren't sure that they could obey him. And he said, if I asked you to throw your children into the ocean, would you do that for me? And he thought for a while, and he said, yes, Baba. So we all put up our hands. Like he asked again, and we all put up our hands. Who will love him? So then he said that he would take our hearts to India. And then he told us about a meeting that he was going to hold in India for a month in 1957. And the description of it was very much like the East-West gathering. And he invited us all to come to this meeting. I would have liked to have come very much, but I had a wife and 2 children. We were struggling financially. And I felt that it would be most inappropriate for me to decide that I could go to India and use part of the family income for that just to do something I wanted to do. And so I didn't put up my hand, even though I wanted very badly to go there. And so he described this meeting again, and he made it sound much more attractive. And then asked, who will come to India to visit me? And I couldn't come. I wanted to go. I'm just sitting in front of him. He's sitting on the divan and on the discourses. And he asks again, and he describes the meeting again, and there's going to be saints and musts and all these wonderful people. And sounds wonderful. And I still want to go, but I'm helpless. So then he said, and I will help you. I thought, if God's helping you, that's different. So I put up my hand. And as soon as I did, he went like that. And here it said, Baba says, you must come to India. And I just felt as though I'd been trapped. Here I was, kind of playing it by ear, being independent, and he just trapped me like that. Just so simple, like taking candy from a kid. And here I am, dependent on him. I've said I'll come. If I didn't, I'd be disobeying the master. I dare disobey him, yet I can't, haven't got the money to go. So I'm totally dependent on him. I realise now how fortunate I was, but at that moment I didn't feel that I was fortunate. I just felt that I'd been trapped. And I felt a hand come within my body and the fingers around my heart and take it out. He actually did help. It wasn't very long after that someone died and left me some money. And it was no connection with the family. And there was money enough to cover the trip. And he had asked for a love gift, which was a little bit off-putting. But I thought, well, Master shouldn't ask you for money. What would be his need for money? He could have all the money he wanted. But I decided in his case, somehow I'd make an exception. And, even in spite of my previous training, just this once. But then, when I looked into it, I found that it was really, he was giving us an opportunity to give him something. And really, what the love gift represented was our accommodation money in India, because our accommodation was being free. He was giving us the accommodation free, and it was only those that could afford to go to India were to go, and they only needed to pay their fare. And if they couldn't afford to pay, the love gift didn't matter. And those that had plenty of money, if they could afford to help make up, well, they could. So I found out many years later that if a master ever accepts a gift from the devotee, that it binds the master to that person, and the master is bound to help that person spiritually. So what he had done was use the accommodation money to give it an excuse, to give us the opportunity to be bound to him, so that he would have to spiritually help us. The emphasis at that meeting was on love, and the emphasis on the next meeting. Also at that meeting he told us that he had come to suffer for humanity, and that the dark cloud was almost upon him, and that when the suffering came, we weren't to worry. It had to happen. That was the purpose of his coming, and it had to be, and we weren't to get concerned about it. It was inevitable. And that was 4 months before the accident in India in December. So the next time that he came in 1958, you could still feel his presence, but the atmosphere was completely different. The emphasis was on obedience that time and not on love. There was still love there, but now the emphasis was on obedience. And it was like as though we were the witnesses to his suffering that he had told us that he had to endure. And we did witness it. It was very real in his face, his bearing, his being. And he was he brought home to us the importance and the seriousness of being obedient to him. And he emphasized that. And how are we going for time? And do you want questions? I don't mind, but... So that was the emphasis then. And one of the things that he said that we went for a walk, and he said that Francis had chosen the correct location. And at times he had to be carried in a carry chair, and Force would carry him over from the meeting hall or from his home to the meeting hall and back again. And one of the things that he said then, when I was standing right beside him, he said, "This is the last time that most of you will see me in the flesh." And I just felt the truth of it, like an electrical impulse. And that was true for me. It wasn't true for probably most of the people. Anyone that had been a long-term Baba lover or lover of a few years, they all went, but I was not able to go in 1962, so I was prevented by my work. And he told us not to leave our jobs, so I couldn't go. And that was true to me, what he said then, and I felt the truth of it as he said it. Well, most of this is written in the book called Practical Spirituality with Meher Baba. I have brought some copies. I don't know whether there are copies here. There may be paperbacks here. Right, I have hardcover if anyone wants. And, okay, is there any questions? You want to ask about anything?
How much is the first version?
To you, $16. I didn't have to pay air freight. I thought I would, because I had an extra bag with 40 odd kilos in it, and it was supposed to cost $105. But as I was approaching the gate of the place where they take the tickets and the details, they said there was no more in that queue, and I was the next one. So I had to go to another queue. And she looked to be a nicer lady. And I told her that the bags were very heavy. And so she put heavy labels on them. I said, be very careful when you're lifting it. And so she got a man to lift it for her. She asked me to sign something to say that if the baggage was damaged, it was because it was heavy and the airline wasn't to be responsible. So I signed that, and she didn't charge me anything. So I won't charge you air freight on it. So the hardcover is $16. I don't know what the soft cover is. It probably isn't much difference, but because it's had to pay freight paid on it. Yes.
Did your wife ever come to follow MeherBaba?
Yes, she did. She met him on the public day, and previously I had wanted a photograph of MeherBaba in the house, and she didn't. Now I could understand that. So I thought, well, we won't argue about this. I'll just keep him in my heart, and we won't have an argument about it. She'll be happy. So, no argument. But when she met him on public day, and I didn't know this on that day because that was a Saturday, and during Saturday morning he asked us, did any of us wish to come to Melbourne with him? And we could come as long as we could afford it and it wouldn't jeopardise our work, because it was for Sunday. We're going down Saturday, be there Sunday, coming back Monday. So I immediately, by this time, you can feel his presence, you love being in his presence, you dislike being out of his presence. Like when it comes to lunchtime, you think of nothing else but Baba and, the time you're going to be back with him. So I jumped at the opportunity of going to Melbourne. And so when I was down there, I noticed that he visited 6 houses. He stayed in one and visited 6. I didn't know why. I just thought that people must have asked him. Visit their home. So when we were coming back on the aircraft, I'm sitting up there and Baba's back here and thinking, I wish I'd have known that you could have invited Baba to your home. Francis didn't tell. And I thought, well, now it wouldn't be possible because the protocol would be to go through Francis, and the next day they're only going for a drive up to the mountains, but it's all arranged, and he's not going to say, yes, we'll invite Baba to your place. He's going to veto it. So I'm just thinking this in the aircraft, and a message comes up, John, come and sit next to MeherBaba. So I go and sit next to Baba, and I think, well, I don't have to go through Francis. I can just now invite Baba to my home. So I said, Baba, would you like to visit my home tomorrow? Yes, 10 o'clock. Go to your seat. So, just like that. So there was another lady, Frances Lee, and just after I'd thought this, she had this thought. Message comes up, Frances, come and sit next to Baba. So Frances goes and sits next to MeherBaba. So she invites Baba to her the next day. Baba says, yes, 11 o'clock, go and sit back in your seat. So now what had happened is that my wife had bought a frame for the picture that I wanted to have after having met him. And she didn't know that he was coming to the house, but she bought a frame for the picture. And she put the picture in the frame and put it on the bookcase while I was away. So she must have liked him the first time she met him at the public meeting. Of course, you don't want to hear about what happened to the house, so. Well, right. What happened to the house? We get home and there's a mad panic and cleaning the house and decide we need a cake and a garland and everything, and it's all at once. And so it's dark and there's no flowers in the garden. So my son climbs up a coral tree up in the backyard, breaks some branches off and gets the little red flowers that are in the coral tree. And so my wife makes a garland with the red flowers. And then she decides to make a cake. I said, well, be sure to put plenty of love in it. So she starts making this cake with the love in it. So, anyway, the cake got burnt on the top. And we had no more ingredients except love. So, what to do? You don't have shops open there. The shops shut at 6 o'clock. Now we have stay open on Thursday night and Friday night till 9 o'clock. But in those days, no, they shut at maybe 5 o'clock. It was winter, it got dark, about 5:30. So we'll say the shops were shut at 6. So now it's, 8 o'clock or something? Everything's shut. You can't get any flour or anything to make a cake. We'd used it all. So what to do? I said, well, what were you going to do? We're going to ice the cake. She says, yes. I said, okay, well, just carefully cut off the burnt. Shh, don't tell him. Carefully cut off the burnt part of the cake. Haven't put this part in the book. The best part. So, and shape it the right shape and everything, and carefully take the burnt part off. So, mix up the icing and ice the cake. And there it is. Oh, and I said, be sure to do it with love. She did. So she mixed the icing with love and iced the cake with love. And so there was the cake full of love. So anyway, we had to clean up the house. So we worked long into the night. And Francis had told me earlier that it was better to live on the property, be close to Baba, because, well, it was just better. So, even though I only lived about half a mile away, I went to live up at Beacon Hill on the property in a tent. It was in the winter and it was a cold wind. So this night I'm coming home late, you see. I'd been up there a few days before and then went to Melbourne and come back home. And no, they're probably thinking I wasn't coming. I probably thought I'd stay at home, sleep at home that night. However, about 1 o'clock I came up and expecting to have a vacant bed there in the tent, and someone else was sleeping in it. So I found a station wagon open and I slept in the back of the station wagon, and I found some blanket or something someone must have didn't need, so I slept in the back of a station wagon. I think the man who owned the station wagon was sleeping in my bed, thinking I wasn't coming up there. So anyway, the next morning, by some remarkable coincidence, most of the people that I'd invited, friends and relatives, to come to the public day, who couldn't come on that day, were available to come to meet Meher Baba at my home. So my mother, my brother was invited and he wouldn't come. One neighbour on one side came, my father-in-law. It was a bit of a mistake with him. He kind of got tricked into it almost, And with another neighbour who was a builder, lived 2 doors up. His father had built this house. And I'd known him for many years, from a teenager, I suppose. However, I had neglected to tell him one thing. I knew MeherBaba. When he was visiting my home, I thought, well, I should tell him. So I told him that this Eastern spiritual master, like Jesus, was coming to visit my home that day, and he was invited. And he declined the invitation. Probably thought I was a bit madder than usual. So what happened with him, though, he went along to pick up a friend who was helping him, an assistant, and at 10 o'clock they were driving along, and just at 10 o'clock, when Baba was coming to our home, this man who'd never heard of MeherBaba started to sing his name. Baba, Baba. I don't know what tune, but he started to sing the name of Baba. And this gave my friend quite a shock. And so much so that he told me about it later. And now with my father-in-law, he, as I mentioned before, was crippled with arthritis. And on that day we were supposed to be going to drive up the mountains. And the message that was sent over to him was that MeherBaba was visiting our home and he was invited to come. But it must have got bent in the transmission, because he came over thinking that we wanted to borrow his bigger car for the trip up to the mountains. And he left it rather late. It was about 5 to 10 when he got there, and it was too late to take him back if he didn't want to meet MeherBaba. And he had left rather hurriedly because it was a warm day, and he'd had his trousers with braces and a flannel singlet, the sleeves and the braces over that. And he wasn't expecting to meet the avatar that morning. And he was rather embarrassed about his dress when he found out what was really happening. So I'd built a porch, a workshop at the end of the property, right up the other end. And it had a little patio in the front of it, and there was chairs and a table, and a nice sunny day, so there was that lovely spot there. So he decides that he'll go there to be out of the way, hoping that he's not seen and the avatar won't see him in his embarrassing state of his clothing. So as he's coming out of the house, he comes to a point here, there's another patio, and he stops there and he says, "I'll be up here if MeherBaba wants to meet me." So, right. So he goes up there, he hobbles up, and he sits down, and MeherBaba, there's a knock at the door. So my wife and I go to the door, and she garlands him, and he embraces her. And then he comes into the house, he comes into our bedroom, and he gestures towards the desk, and he embraces me. I wasn't quite sure at that moment why, but later I figured out that I had bought 2 God Speaks, and they were on the desk. And I bought one to lend to other people, and one to read myself. And I presume that was why I got that embrace. Then we came into the lounge room where the visitors and guests were, and Baba gestures towards his picture and embraces my wife. And then he's introduced to the guests, my mother and father-in-law, oh no, not father-in-law, mother, neighbours, and I forget there's someone else. Anyway, he visits the other rooms, the bathroom, the kitchen. He comes to that point on the patio where my father-in-law had said, if he wants to meet me, I'll be up here.
And he stops there and he doesn't go any further. So I say, Baba, would you like to meet my father-in-law? And he says, would he like to meet me? So I ran up to where my father-in-law was and said, Pop, would you like to meet MeherBaba? And he hops up from his chair with his glasses. Yes, I would. And he makes a step, and by the time he makes the one step, Baba's up there. And the thought occurred, if you make one step towards God, God will make 10 steps towards you. And so Pop says, Salam Alaka. And Erich for Baba says, Alakalam Sam. So Pop had been in Egypt during the First World War, and so he learned some Arabic. So MeherBaba came back to the kitchen, and he had some of the cake that was made with love. And he often he wouldn't have the cake, sometimes in different places. And so the cake was cut, and he took the first slice, and then the other slices were cut and distributed as prasad to the other people. And then he went into the lounge room by himself, and the kids were peeking through the door, cracking the door, and he garlanded the photograph. He put the garland around the photograph and up over the back of the photograph so that it would look as though the garland was on the photograph. So that's the main part of it. Oh, wait on, what happened also. Now, my wife was very interested in going to the movies, like it was her thing. She would go to the movies at least once a week, every Thursday, with the lady down the street. They'd go and see a movie and perhaps do their shopping and catch a taxi home. And I don't think we could afford a taxi in those days, but the lady that she went with down the street could, and I guess she was company for her too, so she used to pay for the taxi. So, and probably none of the other members of the group would, they could take it or leave it, whether there was a movie on that week, whether they went. And they didn't, I don't think, went regularly to movies. But it was her interest and the thing that she regularly did. So MeherBaba invites her to come to the movies with him. And later on he invited everyone else, but at our place he invited her. And so she agrees that she'll come to the movies with him. Of course, this is including her in the group now. So we go to the movies. And then he orders me to buy her a box of chocolates. So I buy my wife a box of chocolates in obedience to the master. And so she gives them to him. So he gives them to everyone as prasad. Any more questions? The film was called The Man Who Never Was. It was a wartime story where the Allies were going to dump a body with papers that they wanted the enemy to believe was happening, planted papers on his body from a submarine, and his body would get washed up on the coast, and the Germans would believe that what was said in the papers to mislead them. Lasted. We left before it finished, but we saw about 55 minutes of it. And when we were coming into when we were at the waiting in the foyer, Baba was waiting in the foyer. It's almost time, isn't it, when you were going home? Is it getting late? Well, okay. Baba was waiting in the foyer while Robert Rouse was buying the tickets, and Baba sat down on the settee, and there's a couple of other people sitting there. We probably shouldn't have sat there, but in our ignorance we did. And a Persian cat came across and jumped up into Baba's lap. And Baba just fondled the cat. And then said in its next life that cat would be a human. It had just gone straight to him. Never looked at anyone else. So then we go upstairs and he orders me to buy my wife some chocolates. And then we go in, we'd ordered 3 full rows upstairs. And it was about 2 rows back from the edge looking over. And then there was a sprinkling of a few people, other people there. And must have been strange for them and unusual, because here was someone coming in with a big group of people, sitting in the middle and directing where everyone was to sit. And I was sitting just behind to the left, but left one and back. So I could see what he did. And at one time during the film, he put on, seemed to be a black hood, put it on under his head. I had seen that done before. He did it once on the airplane, from Melbourne to Sydney. And then, after about 55 minutes, the picture hasn't finished, the movie hasn't finished. Time to go. So, everyone gets up, Baba stands up, everyone stands up. We move off, and there's this whole 3 rows of people moving out. And I'm one of the last to leave. Probably one of the money's worth or something. Anyway, I hear this loudest Roman voice. Who does he think he is? Jesus Christ or somebody.